So, to one of our keynotes, Roger Kain is a fellow of the British Academy, the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Science. It's Vice President of Research in Higher Education Policy. He's a Professor of Humanities in the School of Advanced Study for the University of London, and previously its Dean and Chief Executive from 2010 to 2017. Roger is a Fellow of UCL and Honorary Professor at the University of Exeter, where he was Deputy Vice-Chancellor from 2002 to 2010, and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is the editor of the Volume 5 of the History of Cartography. Cartography in the 19th Century. This project is funded by the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Science Foundation. When I first got in touch with Roger, he had said that he had to check the schedule. But I didn't realize what that meant, and then he got back to me. We had a little bit of timeline with emails because he was in London and I was in Wisconsin. But he said he had to check the schedule because he had to do some teaching in China. And I followed up with, wow, that's incredible. But luckily he was able to adjust his time and be with us today. He's traveled all the way across the pond to be with us, so please help me welcome Dr. Roger Kain.
Thank you, President-elect and Chair of the Conference, for those very kind words. I know what may now be on my epitaph at some point. I hope it's going to be a few years away from now because I've got a lot of work to do here before then. It's a real pleasure actually to be here, and I say that genuinely because, as Tony says, I live 4,000 or so miles away in London in the UK, but I think of Madison, Wisconsin, very much as my second home. I pay property taxes to you, and therefore I feel that does make me someone who is actually living and dwelling and part of the community here. As you will hear in a few minutes, I have been associated with the work that's been going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for probably about 10 years or so, but increasingly, and certainly over the last 4 years or so, in a much more intensive way. I come here 4 or 5 times a year for a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks at a time, to work with colleagues in the office, in Science Hall, in the university, in the Geography Department, and the Geography Department coexists alongside the State Cartography Office, and we have a very positive relationship with one another. We take interns, and in return, the State Cartography Office helps us with some of the more traditional analog cartography that we need to illustrate our work. On the screen, you see the title of my talk, which is about the History of Cartography project. You'll see there are some dates alongside the title, 1987 to 2024. Those are the dates of the published volumes. The first volume in the series was published in 87, and the last volume in the series, with my fingers and toes tightly crossed, will be mine, which will be published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024. The project, though, began quite a while before 1987, probably 10 years before in 77. So this is a 50-year project, which I think when the intellectual historians of the next century come to write the history of academic endeavour in the 20th and 21st centuries, will probably be one of the longest humanities projects running. And it is with grateful thanks to the US federal funds that flowed, as Tony said in his introduction, to the project from the National Endowment of the Humanities and the National Science Foundation, together with the match funding that we require to be eligible for those schemes that comes from our own private philanthropic fundraising, that the project has been able to continue and is now as certain as can be to be funded through to its completion. The founders of the History of Cartography project were two academics from the United Kingdom, both of whom migrated to the United States of America. And both of them, as you will see, sadly, from the caption to this slide, died far, far too young some years ago. J.B. Harley, Brian Harley, was a colleague of mine when I worked at the University of Exeter in the UK, that's down in the southwest of the country. He moved over to the US, to Milwaukee, to the American Geographical Society to be its director and to hold a chair in the geography department at Milwaukee. And secondly, David Woodward. David was a graduate of the University of Swansea, that's in Wales, in the UK. He moved very soon after graduating to become director of the Newberry Library in Chicago, the Newberry Map Library in Chicago, and then moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to the geography department to be a professor of geography. And it was that kind of migration and that the discussions that those two men had in the 1970s and 1980s that led to the idea of the History of Cartography project. So it was established in the university here in Madison, Wisconsin, and it remains there in Science Hall. So what was it that these two academics wanted to achieve through the History of Cartography project? Well, the slide there suggests that there were four reasons. The first was to create what I've just called a comprehensive work of reference. A work of reference at a global scale. At that time, in the late years of the 20th century, there had been a lot of work undertaken in the history of cartography. Very many local studies, a lot of studies of individual maps, the earliest, the greatest, whatever, of particular areas, maps of one particular part of the world, maps of one region of the world. But there was nothing that represented anything that could be thought of as a history at a global scale. So that was one of the first objectives. The second was to create a guide for future researchers to come along and to use, to provide a guide to the scholarly literature of the history of maps and mapping, particularly to that which is not written in the English language and so not accessible to very many people. And thirdly, to demonstrate what I've called the validity of studying maps as human documents. Maps, as you will all know from your work in the digital mapping sphere, maps play a vital role in human lives. They encapsulate knowledge, they transmit knowledge and information. The possession of that knowledge and information imbues those who hold it with a kind of power, very easily identified and very easily understood by reference, for example, to military maps, but also in the world that you people are involved in property mapping. Mapping properties enables taxation systems to be set up on a fair and equitable basis, establishes rights to land title, and so on. So the maps are very much human documents and have a purpose in human society. And then fourthly, and this is rather more academic, to perhaps lay the foundation for a new subdiscipline of history. There's military history, there's urban history, there's political history. And so what they wanted to do was to establish another subdiscipline of history, the history of cartography, the history of maps and mapping, with a set of particular kinds of methods and ways of inquiry techniques, and following a very broad definition of what is a map. So that's where they were when the project started. And now on this next slide, I helps to encapsulate where the project is now in the early years of 2020. The work, as you will see, follows a broadly chronological approach from prehistory in the earliest volume through to the 20th century. Those you will see down towards the end of that sequence, the volumes have not been appearing in chronological order, though when the whole series is produced, there will be a chronological history from prehistory through to the 20th century. The 20th century volume has appeared before that of the European Enlightenment and before that of the 19th century. And that is a consequence of the untimely demise of the two people who set up the project. Volume 5, which will be the last to appear, would have been edited had he lived by David Woodward, and it is an immense honour for me to take, or to be invited to take his place to edit that work. So a basic chronological approach, running through from classical and ancient times through to the 20th century. 6 volumes, but a multiple number of books. As you will see, Volume 2 is composed of 3 large books. I'll give you the dimensions and numbers of pages in a few minutes. Volume 4 will appear published this April, and there will be a launch event, a public event in University of Wisconsin-Madison on the 25th of April, that's a Saturday, and I will send details of that, or get them sent to Tony, and Tony, I'm sure, through your association will cascade them to you, and any of you who can come, I'm sure, will be most welcome at that event. So that will appear, the penultimate volume will appear this coming April, and then as you see right at the bottom, the work that I'm involved in will come out, fingers crossed, in 2024. Let me just say a little bit more about the various periods of map history that are encapsulated in the History of Cartography project. This is an illustration representative of the sorts of maps that appeared in Volume 1. It's a manuscript map. This is a 13th century from a man called Matthew Paris, who wrote a manuscript that ran titled Universal History of the World, but it appears in manuscript. This is in the 13th century before printing, so that all maps were hand-drawn and took the kind of form that you see there. In 1992, the first book of Volume 2 appeared about cartography of the traditional Islam and South Asian societies. And on the screen, aside of the title page of the book, is a portion of a surviving world map by Piri Reis. This is an Ottoman map, and in the showing the part of the Atlantic, Africa on the right-hand side, and the coast of America on the left-hand side. It's compiled from a number of earlier sources. Only this little bit survives, and that, of course, is a characteristic of the history of cartography, of the history of maps and mapping. There are undoubtedly, from this early period, many more maps that are lost than are those that survive through one way or another to come down through the archives to us in the 21st century. Book 2 of Volume 2 deals with the traditional East and Southeast Asian societies. And this is a detail of a manuscript map of Japan's inland sea, that sea which lies between Honshu, Shikoku and Kyushu Islands. Manuscript again, because although we are now in 1687, as you will see by the date there, manuscripts, tradition of mapping, coexisted along with printed maps right the way through until the 19th and early years of the 20th century. And then the third component of Volume 2 dealt with the traditional maps of indigenous societies. Africa, Americas, Australasia, and the Pacific societies. And this is a map from an Australian Aboriginal source, which displays information about places in the form of a crocodile. It's a concept which is difficult for our 21st century Western way of imagining the world to understand. But it's no less a map than the topographic maps, for example, of the US GS. And then on to the European Renaissance, firmly in the time of printed books. Again, two components to the Renaissance volume. I've just chosen an image from what is the first atlas of maps of the world. Atlases which put collections of individual maps, sheet maps together and bound them into an atlas. This was Ortelius in 1570, so we're just in the age of printing. It was conceived, and it was compiled, and it was printed in Antwerp, in Belgium. Antwerp was one of the seats of innovation in cartography and map printing in the late 16th century. And of course now we're talking about printed volume. Printed volumes could go through a series of editions, and that first atlas of Abraham Ortelius went through a number of editions through to about 1598, by which time it had grown to have 190 sheet maps bound within it. So the atlases are very much kind of living organisms which can be developed and can grow in that kind of way. So we're now up to 2007, and at that time there was a major rethink happening in the project offices. Encapsulated on the slide is the history of cartography project as it was in numbers, and some of those numbers are very big numbers, and for a publisher they're quite frightening numbers because that makes them very expensive. These are 6 physical books with 5,000 pages between them, 16,000 footnotes. This is the scholarly apparatus which enables future researchers to come along and to follow and to develop the work that has been written in those books. 3.1 million words, 2,740 illustrations. Volume 3 alone, the volume on the Renaissance, had 1.3 million words, 1.5 million if you include the bibliography and all the other stuff, and 8,000 plus footnotes. What that meant was that it was becoming a publishing project of a scale that was starting to raise real issues with the publishers of the project, which from the very beginning was the University of Chicago Press. These are books that were extremely expensive to produce, therefore they have a high sale price and a small-ish print run, and that kind of business model is one that's really quite difficult to sustain. The project was kind of growing out of a bit out of control. So there was a lot of discussion within the project about what the intellectual challenges would be for writing the history of cartography after 1650, after the period of those first 3 volumes. The first issue is what I've called the kind of mismatch between the amount of history, that's a rather crude way of putting it, but the amount of history and the size of the volumes. Because mapping activities started to explode after 1650, and then again after about 1800, and then yet again after 1900. So the amount of mapping that was going on, the amount of stuff that was there to have its history written about was increasing in that kind of exponential rate, which caused an intellectual challenge. So how do you cope with writing about the history of something which is increasing in scale exponentially? Secondly, the centuries after 1650 are progressively less studied by map historians. Map historians have always been interested by the earliest, the finest, the shiniest, the most valuable, and whatever, the most collectible of maps. Much more attention written and devoted to the history of early maps rather than maps of later times. So the later volumes are increasingly going to need to present the results of new research, because to write the history of the more recent periods, the writers had to go out and actually do some research to find out what was happening, rather than just synthesizing the writings of earlier people. So instead of synthesizing, they became increasingly volumes which would need to present the results and to actually commission and undertake new research. And then, as I'm sure everyone becomes aware, cartography becomes less local and increasingly more and more international after about 1650. And so while it makes sense to structure, for example, the Renaissance volume by national traditions, mapping in France, mapping in Germany, mapping in French North America, British North America, and whatever, that doesn't work for the 20th century, by which time mapping is a much more international undertaking. And so the decision was made to structure the later volumes around types of mapping activity. And the history of cartography was recast from a narrative history into what is essentially an encyclopedia format. So the early volumes characteristically consist of work by 30 or 40 authors writing 30 or 40 long chapters about mapping in particular parts of the world. By comparison, the later volumes, like the one that I'm involved with, have something like 200 or so authors writing something like 400 or so entries of an encyclopedia. What does that look like? Well, the way in which the encyclopedias are organized in a mapping in terms of the mapping is that they recognise three kind of clusters of different components of maps and the mapping process. The first of those is about ways of representing the world. And so there are entries about surveying and observation, gathering of data at whatever particular time a particular part of history is concerned with. And then how those data can be mapped, can be visualized, and so on. So ways of representing the world, organized in that kind of cluster system. Secondly, around ways of making maps, the methodological context, if you like, of mapping, art and craft and cartography, science and cartography, and then following on geodetic surveying and so on through the various ways of making maps. And then thirdly, the social context of maps, patterns of map use, turning the lens from looking at how were maps made to, well, what were they used for, how were they used, the public sphere in cartography, the role that maps played in public areas, the map trade, map collecting and so on, state formation and cartography, how maps were used by states for administration, military cartography, property mapping and so on. So there's a hierarchical sort of series of clusters of pieces of work which were done, which together form an encyclopedia of the history of cartography of a particular period. So for each cluster of entries, there's a series of entries written which start from high-level overviews down to the specific. So if we take, for example, the property mapping cluster of entries, one which will resonate, I guess, with you, there's an overview at an interpretive and very conceptual level, and then entries that run through property mapping in particular areas, who did what, when was it done, why, those sort of issues, down to very specific topics such as the mapping of urban properties in particular places. And then, in addition, there are biographical entries, providing information on key individuals, key institutions in the map process, which have broadly similar content. They have a fairly specific content regardless of what they're about. They give some key dates, some key components of cartographic significance and so on. And for all those categories of entries, what we did was to define a kind of a rubric, a sort of template for what should be included in the writing of a particular entry, to guide contributors and above all to try to control the length at which people would write. So there were very specific lengths, as I will talk about in a few minutes. We call them scope descriptions, and that became the kind of template that was to ensure that whether we've got someone writing, for example, property mapping in the Ottoman Empire or property mapping in British North America, the same kind of issues would be checked off in the content of what was to come through. So the final volumes in the history of cartography will be the same physical size and the same design. They will all look from the outside exactly the same, but internally they'll be very different. They will have, each of them, as I've suggested, 400 or so substantive entries. Variously, those will be interpretive entries, conceptual statements, and they'll be quite long, up to about 10,000 words. 10,000 words is just about the maximum length of any single entry in the last 3 volumes of history. Then, below those will be more focused entries, detailed statements of key people, key institutions, and so on. And those run across from 2,000 to 8,000 words. Substantial pieces of writing, but not huge chapters. And then summary entries, some of them down to be as small as 800 words or so, which basically are directing someone to other areas where you can find information on those particular topics. As editors, we write a substantial introduction to provide a sort of synthesis, because one of the issues with an encyclopedia is that, well, the entries are arranged alphabetically from A through to Z, unlike a book, which is organized by chapters, which have a kind of sequence to them and a kind of structure that makes intellectual sense as you go through them. An encyclopedia, the sense is that of the alphabet. And so by writing an introduction, we can draw together some of the key themes that come through the history of maps and mapping, history of cartography in a particular time period that the volume is dealing with. So they will be about 1 million words each. Each will have about 1,000 illustrations. Big innovation which happened with the final 3 volumes by comparison with the first 3 volumes of the series is that we now can have full colour throughout. One of the great technological innovations that means that colour printing is hardly any different in cost to printing in black and white, full colour throughout. And something like 200 to 300 contributors per volume. So that as editors, it's rather like, Tony, you as an organiser of a conference, what you're doing is trying to manage a lot of individuals. And yes, you are very thankful when your keynote speakers turn up on the day and you know that's taken care of. So part of our job is actually recruiting this band of contributors and then making sure that everyone writes and everyone gets it done to the day when the whole thing has to go off to the press. Because as with a big conference, the thing is only as good as the strength of its weakest link, and you've just got to try and make sure you don't have too many weak links, or you have plan Bs to work around. So that it's as much a managerial role as it is a sort of scholarly role, so that as an editor you have to be something of a manager of people as well as someone who's ensuring that there is a kind of scholarly integrity to what is being produced. The first 3 volumes then published 1977 to 2007, the last 3 volumes 2015 to 24. There's also, in parallel with the paper printed books, a digital edition. University of Chicago Press has made volumes 1 to 3 and volume 6 available online and such free of charge, open access by the University of Chicago Press. Now, this was a difficult decision for the University of Chicago Press to make. It was very much the early days of open access publishing, open science. There was a concern that by making things available free of charge digitally, well, would that completely undermine the business model which relied on library purchases and individual purchases of printed volumes or of restricted e-books, which was required to actually make the project work from a publisher's point of view. We had a lot of discussions. Part of the driver was that every 2 years we had to put into the National Endowment for the Humanities for a new grant to pay the cost of the next 2 years of work. And we were starting to find that in some of the peer reviews, the assessors' reports that came in through, all very, very positive, but saying, well, there's a lot of federal dollars going into this project. Should not US taxpayers be getting access to this in a way that they're not getting access to it now, i.e. should it be made available digitally and for free. And the kind of compromise, which I think seems to be working quite well, was that the University of Chicago Press makes things available free online after 2 years. So that there's a paywall for 2 years to enable them to recover the costs of the editorial and printing process from publishing process from their point of view. But then those works are available for free to people with an internet access from wherever you are around the world. And I invite you to go to the University of Chicago Press website and have a look yourself if you would like. And what in fact the press has found is that, yes, a lot of people do that. And some people, not everyone of course, but some people say, actually I really do like what I see there, I would like a copy of the printed book. And so as the works have gone progressively online for free, there's been a bit of an uptick in the sales of volumes. So far from undermining the business model that was established, they have actually generated some additional income themselves. So do look at those if you are interested. It's there for you to see. So let me now just say a bit about specifically what I'm doing, have been doing over the last 10 years or so with Volume 5 Cartography in the 19th century. 19th century, I find a very interesting period, otherwise I wouldn't be spending all this time in it. But it's a period of really very significant change in maps and map making. It was a time of the institutionalization of map making and map use. State mapping agencies established here at the USGS, Ordnance Survey in the UK. The term cartography was first used in the 1820s as a descriptor for what it is, what is involved in the acquiring data, the processes of mapping, the publishing and dissemination of maps and the use of maps. All those kinds of processes wrapped up under the term first used in the 1820s, cartography. And the 19th century we can perhaps think of as the era of cartography. From the 1850s, from about halfway through the 19th century, map making becomes increasingly international. International kind of standards set by international congresses, talking about various kinds of components of maps and map making. Mapping increasingly international. As a result, mapping practices becoming more uniform. I haven't got the slide here, but that I could show you a map of the city of Chengdu or any other city in China. It would be covered with script, which certainly to me, and I'm sure to most of us, would be unintelligible, but it would show the pattern of streets and buildings, which will enable us to find our way around the city in the same way as we can around the city in the US or in Europe. An increasing uniformity of mapping practices and the language of mapping that's becoming itself an international language. The establishment of the permanent mapping organisations, I've mentioned USGS and the British Ordnance Survey, and cartography intersecting with scientific inquiry. Maps being used, for example, in the 19th century to understand disease, to understand why did cholera spread like it did, by mapping incidences. The early epidemiologists were able to get a sense of, this is all to do with polluted water supply or whatever. Disease and health mapping intersecting with advancing science, in this case in medicine. Map consumption continued to expand. Printing, yes, of course, but printing has been available for centuries before the 19th century, but late in the 18th and through the 19th century, cheaper versions of printing techniques like lithography, which enabled maps to be reproduced much more cheaply, came into common use. And so that helped expand the consumption of maps, not just from an elite of wealthy people that could afford to buy maps, or educated people who could look at maps in libraries, but maps became something of everyday consumption. And as you will all be aware, maps became increasingly conformable in an aesthetic sense as map design, particularly the introduction in the 19th century of colour in map printing and map production came in. So that there's a lot of stuff going on in the 19th century that was kind of the prehistory of the present, as well as being the sort of signing off on the kinds of practices that happened and were common in the past. So the aim of my volume, as I see it, is to try to create something of a balance. There are some issues that were, and some kinds of mapping that were unique to the 19th century, that were children of the 19th century. Think of the railways, for example, railroad mapping didn't exist before, and it's something which was born in the 19th century. Whilst ensuring that there's a continuity and a bridging of topics from the Enlightenment, the 18th century period that predated my work, through to the 20th century, because a lot of mapping topics in the 19th century transcend two, or in some cases, three of those time periods. So how do I try to get some kind of balance that would serve all those purposes? Well, it's absolutely reliant on my international advisory board. Each of these encyclopedic volumes of history has a board of people who are working on a pro bono basis to advise us as to how to go about it. And we try to make those advisory boards representative of key interests, stakeholder groups. There is a body which some of you may well be familiar with, the International Cartographic Association. The International Cartographic Association has a number of commissions that it's set up underneath it. It has a commission on the history of cartography. And so there are members of our advisory board who represent that commission. We have their key office holders in the history of cartography, the editors of the key journals and so on, historians of science, because cartography has a scientific tradition, historians of the book, because maps in a sense are like books. They are ways in which knowledge is communicated through printing, and so historians of the book can advise us. Historians of social science, because increasingly, especially in the 19th and 20th century, maps were used in a social scientific way by government and state agencies. And then, to ensure that we've got our global position right, advisors from the Americas, from Europe, from Asia, and from Australasia. Now, one of the key issues that we needed to get sorted in these encyclopedia volumes is what is the appropriate kind of regional breakdown of the world that we should use for various periods in history. And in volume 4, The Enlightenment, the one which is about to be published in April, the approach was of a European nation state and national colonial activity approach. So we have British North America, Portuguese America, Spanish America, New France, and then the countries of Europe, France, Great Britain, Portugal. This is the kind of regional breakdown of the world that was used for the Enlightenment volume, the one which runs from around about 1650 through to the end of the 18th century. European nation states, that was the way in which the world worked in those periods. If If we skip right way forward to the 20th century, well, of course, the world of cartography doesn't work like that anymore. There's much less granularity. And so you see there the kind of regionality that was derived by used by the editor of the volume on the 20th century, much less granularity. And maybe unsurprisingly, the 19th century sort of sits somewhere in between. Less granularity than for the period of the Enlightenment, more granularity than for the 20th century. So for each of those areas, we would be looking at, for example, property mapping in Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and so on through. And then the next category of maps, military mapping in, and so on. That provides that kind of regional component to the topical components, the thematic components of the encyclopedia structure. And in that kind of way, we build up 400 or so entries that form the total content of the work. So where am I in this story? So here's a timeline, which part of it is history, so I can say, I can tick and say, yep, that's done. Some of it is yet to come. So to start off with, there were these detailed consultations with the advisory board on the entries and contributors. We would draft lists of entries, draft lists of contributors, send them around, get comments, ensuring always that we were trying to get the scholars who are doing the most up-to-date work, and to try to get people certainly from all generations and with a diverse background coming in to be the contributors to the volume. So that took a period. Towards the end of 2012, the entry list was starting to stabilise, though we were still needing to identify potential contributors. It's easy to think about what should be in it, more difficult to think about, okay, so who's going to write that particular bit? Who knows the detail of that particular work in that particular part of the country? And that was a much more long drawn-out process. The way the History of Cartography project operates with respect to its publisher, the University of Chicago Press, is not a usual one. Usual process for getting a book published by a publisher is that you start having some initial discussions with a particular publisher. If they show some kind of interest, they usually say, well, would you go away and write 2 or 3 specimen chapters, please? When you've done that, please send them in, and we will then get them assessed by peer reviewers. That's not really possible to do that with an encyclopedia, because you can't sort of say, well, let's just have 10 entries, and on the basis of those 10, we will decide. So what we had to do was to write a very detailed prospectus and submit that to the press. We did that for Volume 5 in the early months of 2013. And then that went to the University of Chicago Press Board and got approval, and it was approved in June. And that approval means that is the end. They are now committed contractually, and we are contractually committed to deliver, and they are contractually committed to publish what it is that we offer them. So it was a way of building a kind of trust between the publisher who's taking the financial risk and ourselves who are taking an intellectual risk and getting a group of contributors together who we have to guarantee that their work will get published. So it's that kind of two-way trust. That was done. Once we had approval, we could then go out, having identified people who we would like to write for us, to issue invitations, which we did in 2013, 2014, and by the end of 2014, some of the first entries arrived, and we are now in the process of editing entries, selecting the images that will illustrate them, getting the permissions to use those images, because now that The work is published as a printed book, it's published as a paid-for e-book, and then eventually, after a 2-year embargo period, will become a free open access e-book. We have to get permissions to use, with rights to use worldwide electronic rights for images. And given that we are taking images from archives in multitudes of countries at different stages of development, that is no small task. I'm intending to submit the manuscript and the illustrations to the press in 2022, and it will be published in early 2024, at which point I will try to remember, if I can, to make sure that you people get an invitation to the launch party, which will be a great launch party, I can tell you, when the whole project comes to an end in 2024. And I will end with the slide with which I began, which summarizes where we are. Do you let me know, please, if you want to have more information about this multi-volume definitive history of maps and map making. 3 more volumes to go, if are in my notes. Well, actually, it's now only 2 more to go, because one is imminently on its way to printed presses, are literally rolling now, I'm sure, and that will be launched in April this year, and then there's just the one to go. So there we are. It's been a privilege for me to be involved with the project, to continue to be involved with it. I love thinking of Madison as my second home, which it will have been for 10 years or so by the time I finish this work. And it's a joy to come and visit here, and joy to work amongst colleagues living in Madison and the state of Wisconsin. So it's with those words that I come to the end of my presentation. Tony and colleagues, thank you very much indeed.